The U.S. will add an additional 25% tariff to 50% on steel and aluminum coming into the U.S.
Our tariffs will remain in place until the U.S. tariffs are withdrawn, and not a moment sooner.
What if I told you that America's biggest industrial defeat in 2025 didn't come from China, but from the country right next door? Imagine factories grinding to a halt overnight, jobs disappearing, and prices skyrocketing, all because of a single decision. Washington thought it was protecting America, but instead, it handed Canada an industrial advantage it hasn't had in decades. And what happened next will shock you. This isn't just a trade dispute. It's a battle for the future of industry, energy, and even defense. Stay with me because you won't see this coming. In early 2025, the U.S. took a dramatic step, doubling tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum imports from 25% to 50%.
President Trump continues to take bold action to protect America's critical steel and aluminum industries.
Officially, it was to protect American jobs and industries. But nearly half of all U.S. aluminum comes from Canada, which produces 80% of North America's primary aluminum. By cutting off that supply, the U.S. wasn't protecting itself. It was striking its own industrial heart. Factories across the Midwest felt the impact immediately. Aluminum prices surged to $1,325 per ton, record highs. GM, Ford, Boeing, and other manufacturing giants faced a brutal choice: absorb crushing cost increases or halt production lines. Mark Richardson, an Ohio aerospace supplier, described it as raw material prices swinging like a live wire. The effects rippled fast. Energy demand dropped, utilities struggled, and workers worried about losing their livelihoods. Mike Jensen, shift supervisor at Alcoa in Davenport, Iowa, said, "We used to run 3 shifts non-stop. Now I'm sending people home twice a week. You can see the stress on their faces. Mortgages don't wait for aluminum prices to stabilize." Meanwhile, Ottawa was calm, surgical even. Canada wasn't panicking. They were executing a master plan.
Today marked the latest in President Trump's unprecedented series of U.S. tariffs that are designed to reshape the international trading system.
1.5 billion Canadian dollars were invested in upgrading the Alouette smelter, one of North America's largest aluminum facilities. Long-term, low-cost contracts with Hydro-Quebec guaranteed stable electricity and production costs for years. Line engineer Sophie Gagol said, "It's not just about new machines, it's about knowing we'll still be here in 5 years."
Expanding its tariff on steel and aluminum, it now applies to more than 400 products that have parts made of the metals, so wind turbines, rail cars, even furniture.
Within weeks, Canada locked in long-term aluminum deals with the EU, Japan, the UK, Singapore, and Italy, all tariff-free. Asian smelters canceled U.S. contracts and switched to Quebec, drawn by lower costs, cleaner energy, and political stability. Luc Bush, owner of a 40-person extrusion plant outside Trois-Rivières, said, "Last month we shipped our first order to Osaka. 10 years ago that would have been a dream." But Canada wasn't only focused on immediate profits. Ottawa's next step would redraw North America's industrial logistics map. In the first quarter of 2025, the federal government officially classified clean hydro-powered aluminum as a strategic national asset alongside petroleum and rare earth minerals. This meant stricter export oversight, targeted subsidies, and guaranteed infrastructure investment, locking aluminum into Canada's green industrial future for the next decade. At the heart of this plan was the port of Saguenay in Quebec, historically reliant on U.S. ports and rail corridors. Ottawa invested $2.3 billion to expand capacity for 69,000-ton vessels and boost annual throughput by 15 million tons. A 375-kilometer rail link from Alouette to the port cut shipment times by 28% and reduced per-ton transport costs by nearly 12 Canadian dollars. Pierre Ganol, CEO of Saguenay Port Authority, said, "Our products will leave on our terms, not someone else's." Mayor Julie Dufour called it a generational shift. This isn't just metal leaving the dock, it's jobs, new shops, young people coming back instead of moving to Montreal. The move aligned perfectly with Europe's carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, which taxes high-carbon aluminum heavily. Quebec's low-carbon aluminum enters tariff-free, giving Canadian exporters a 180 to 200 euros per ton advantage over U.S. competitors relying on fossil fuel smelting. Canada didn't stop there. 1.1 billion Canadian dollars were invested to link Sagan with Ontario's EV corridor and Manitoba's lithium battery hub, creating a closed-loop supply chain. Aluminum frames from Quebec, batteries from Manitoba, and final assembly in Ontario, all powered by domestic clean energy. In 2024, Canadian EV exports grew 22% year-over-year, and projections show they could double by 2027 if infrastructure continues expanding. By re-engineering logistics and production, Canada ensured its most valuable industrial exports could bypass U.S. territory entirely. What began as a simple tariff dispute had become a strategic realignment across North America, shuttering factories, costing jobs, and handing Canada an industrial advantage it hasn't held in decades. While Washington scrambled in partisan gridlock, Ottawa moved decisively, locking in multi-billion-dollar contracts, expanding ports, and securing its role as a dominant industrial power. And this was just the beginning. They've essentially de-risked their trade from Washington's unpredictability, said trade economist Angela Carter from the University of Waterloo. That gives them leverage not just in metals, but in every downstream industry tied to those metals. And Canada's next target wasn't cars or shipping lanes, it was something far more critical, a sector deeply embedded in U.S. national security. Losing control here could directly affect Pentagon readiness. For Washington, this was no longer just an economic challenge. It was the opening move in a much larger contest, because Ottawa's next play wasn't about profit margins. It was about controlling the backbone of U.S. defense capability. Aluminum isn't just used in cars or construction. It's essential for missiles, aircraft fuselages, armored vehicles, and satellite frames. The Department of Defense's 2024 procurement report revealed a startling dependency. Over 42% of U.S. high-purity aluminum imports came from Canada, and certain missile and satellite programs relied on Canadian suppliers for nearly 60% of their needs. When U.S. smelters began shutting down in early 2025 due to tariffs, Pentagon supply planners went on high alert. You can't build an F-35 or a hypersonic glide body without precision-grade aluminum, warned Frank Kendall, former U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition. If your ally is also your single point of failure, you've created a strategic vulnerability. Canada sensed this dependency and moved quickly to convert it into leverage. In its 2025 federal budget, Ottawa boosted defense spending by 6.2%, earmarking $700 million Canadian dollars annually to expand aerospace materials production and integrate into NATO and Indo-Pacific defense networks. This wasn't a flashy procurement spree, it was a calculated upstream strategy, increasing smelting capacity, upgrading metallurgical quality, and securing long-term contracts with major defense companies like Airbus, Lockheed Martin, and BAE Systems. The effect was immediate. Rio Tinto's Canadian division, already the world's largest low-carbon aluminum producer, announced 3 multi-year defense contracts, prioritizing Canadian aluminum for civilian and military aircraft programs. Industry insiders reported Canada's green aluminum commanded a 15 to 18% premium, not just for environmental standards, but for precision-grade quality required in aerospace. Meanwhile, U.S. defense manufacturers felt the squeeze. The Congressional Budget Office warned that aluminum price volatility could add $1.3 billion in unexpected costs to Pentagon programs over 2 years. Production delays were visible. The F-35 line in Fort Worth reported a 3-month lag in parts delivery, partly due to bottlenecks in precision aluminum. But Ottawa didn't stop at defense. The next phase was green tech, a sector where the U.S. was already struggling to keep pace. While Washington scrambled to manage tariffs, Canada quietly built a fully integrated green manufacturing ecosystem. Its EV sector alone grew 22% in exports in 2024, with Bloomberg projections showing a potential doubling by 2027. The secret? A closed-loop supply chain few countries can match. aluminum frames from Quebec, lithium-ion batteries from Manitoba, final assembly in Ontario's EV corridor, all powered by clean hydroelectric energy. Marcus Rivera, 27, a technician at Stellantis LG battery plant in Windsor, said, "I got hired right out of trade school. My dad worked in an auto plant that closed in 2009. Now he says, I'm building the future." Lithium production surged too. Canada produced 22,000 tons of lithium carbonate equivalent in 2024, up 14% from the previous year. Projects like Nemaska Lithium in Quebec and Snow Lake in Manitoba are expected to push output to 35,000 tons annually by 2026. "This isn't just raw materials," said Jose Morin, senior analyst at Clean Energy Canada. "It's about controlling every step from mine to showroom." Investments poured in. 5 billion Canadian dollars for a new battery plant in Windsor with LG Energy Solution, and Tesla quietly signed long-term supply agreements for Canadian aluminum and nickel, citing environmental standards and supply reliability. By Q2 2025, Canada had overtaken Germany in newly announced EV projects. Ottawa's green industrial agreements with the EU and UK guaranteed tariff-free access for Canadian EVs and components if emissions standards were met. Meanwhile, U.S. manufacturers, relying on higher emission materials, were being priced out. Michael Harvey, VP of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, said, "Every percentage point of carbon reduction is a competitive advantage, and Canada is banking those points in bulk." Washington's EV sector struggled with fragmented supply chains and political uncertainty. Inflation Reduction Act subsidies helped domestically, but foreign buyers hesitated. The International Energy Agency reported that U.S. EV export growth in 2024 was less than half of Canada's pace. Ottawa's strategy went beyond cars and batteries. It was a blueprint for anchoring national security, trade resilience, and climate policy into one industrial strategy. By mid-2025, Canada was converting its green tech and metals into diplomatic leverage. Every ton of low-carbon aluminum, every kilogram of lithium carbonate, every battery rolling out of Canadian plants became a bargaining chip. In the first 6 months of 2025 alone, Canada signed 3 major trade agreements: a €4.6 billion green tech partnership with the EU for joint investments over 5 years, a 15-year clean energy supply accord with Japan guaranteeing tariff-free Canadian aluminum for automotive and aerospace sectors, an expanded CPTP framework giving preferential access to Canadian EVs and battery components. These agreements locked in over 12 billion Canadian dollars in export contracts through 2030. Trade Minister Mary Ang declared, "We've moved from being a commodity exporter to a strategic partner, reshaping Canada's position in trade, defense, and climate negotiations." The appeal was clear. German automakers, under pressure to meet the EU's 2035 zero-emission mandate, could source compliant materials from a politically stable supplier, with aluminum price volatility of just 3.8% year over year, compared to 11.5% for U.S. produced equivalents. Canada had turned a simple tariff dispute into a multi-layered industrial, defense, and green tech victory, leaving the U.S. scrambling to compete. Japan and South Korea quickly realized Canada was the gateway to reduce reliance on Chinese raw materials without sacrificing quality or environmental compliance. Tokyo estimated that the aluminum deal alone would save its aerospace sector $450 million. Across the Pacific and Atlantic, Canada's web of strategic trade agreements was quietly reshaping global markets, locking in long-term deals that the U.S. could no longer compete for. By mid-2025, Ottawa had merged its industrial strength with defense influence. Dual-use supply chains, linking EV batteries, lithium, and high-grade aerospace aluminum, gave Canada unprecedented leverage. Europe, Asia, and allies in the Indo-Pacific now relied on Canadian materials for both green tech and defense programs. Any disruption would hit multiple critical sectors at once, effectively giving Ottawa dual veto power over production and procurement decisions. This wasn't luck, it was calculated strategy. Canada had transformed from a reliable supplier into a strategic hub, commanding markets, supply chains, and alliances. Ports, railways, and trade agreements were all optimized for speed, resilience, and influence. Washington was left scrambling while Ottawa quietly locked in dominance over the 21st century industrial landscape. So here's the question. Can the United States reclaim the ground it has lost, or is North America's industrial center of gravity shifting permanently north? If you want to see more deep dives like this, breaking down global power moves, hidden strategies, and untold economic stories, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what's coming next, because the world is changing faster than you think.